As a joke, the millionaire invited his secretary to his brother's wedding. The groom was shocked when he saw her. Jackson Carter sat in his luxurious office in the heart of New York City, gazing at the city through the enormous windows. His cold, calculating gaze contrasted with the warmth of the sunset bathing the buildings. In his hands, he held a wedding invitation, elegantly decorated with gold trim. It was for his younger brother, Henry's wedding. Henry Carter and Vanessa Mitchell cordially invite you to celebrate their marriage. Jackson read quietly, with a hint of bitterness in his voice. The millionaire lawyer crumpled the invitation in his fist, feeling anger and resentment growing inside him. It had always been this way. Henry, the favorite, the heir, the one adored by everyone. And now, even in love, it seemed his younger brother was surpassing him. Jackson went to his private bar and poured himself a whiskey, drinking it in one gulp. The alcohol burned his throat, but not as much as the memory of that night, just a few months ago, when he discovered the truth that would change his life forever. Flashback. Jackson was searching through his late father's office, looking for documents for a legal case related to the family businesses. At the bottom of a drawer, he found a yellowed envelope. When he opened it, his world crumbled. It was his adoption certificate. The words danced before his eyes. Jackson Carter, legally adopted by Edward and Mary Carter. Dates, signatures, official seals. It was all there, black on white. He wasn't a Carter by blood. He wasn't the rightful heir he had always believed himself to be. End of flashback. The memory made Jackson grip the empty glass tightly. Since that day, his resentment towards Henry had turned into pure destructive hatred. His younger brother, without knowing it, had enjoyed everything that rightfully belonged to him. The unconditional love of their parents, the inheritance, the social recognition. "It's time for you to pay, little brother," Jackson muttered, a malicious smile forming on his lips. At that moment, the door to his office opened softly. Sarah, his faithful secretary, entered with a stack of documents. "Mr. Carter, here are the contracts you asked to review," she said in a soft voice. Jackson looked at her intently, an idea forming in his mind. Sarah was beautiful, discreet, and most importantly, had no connection to his social circle. She was perfect for his plan. "Sarah, leave that. For a moment, I have a proposal for you," Jackson said, his tone soft but loaded with intention. The young woman looked at him with curiosity and a little apprehension. She knew her boss well and knew that behind that charming smile often lurked dark intentions. "What is it about, sir?" she asked, cautiously. Jackson approached, showing her the wedding invitation. "My younger brother is getting married in a month. I want you to accompany me as my partner." Sarah blinked in surprise. "But sir, we don't have that kind of relationship." I know, Jackson waved his hand, dismissing it. "I just need you to pretend to be my girlfriend during the wedding. It's an important event and I don't want to go alone. I'll pay you generously." "Of course." The proposal hung in the air, loaded with unspoken implications. Sarah hesitated, her instinct telling her there was something more behind this seemingly innocent request. "I don't know, Mr. Carter. I don't feel comfortable lying," she began. Jackson moved closer, his imposing presence filling the space between them. "Sarah, you're my most trusted employee. You know I can be very generous to those who help me, and you also know it's not a good idea to disappoint me." The veiled threat didn't go unnoticed by Sarah. She swallowed hard, aware that rejecting Jackson Carter could have serious consequences for her career and her life. "All right, sir," she finally yielded. "I'll accompany you to the wedding." Jackson smiled triumphantly. "Excellent decision, Sarah. I promise you, it will be an unforgettable experience." As Sarah left the office feeling trapped in a situation she didn't fully understand, Jackson turned back to the window. His plan was in motion. Soon, very soon, Henry would know the taste of humiliation and loss. What Jackson didn't know was that his plan would set in motion a chain of events that would unearth long-buried secrets, not only of the Carter family, but also of Sarah herself, Secrets that, once revealed, would change the fate of everyone involved in ways none of them could have imagined. Sarah arrived at her modest apartment that night, her mind still reeling from Jackson Carter's strange proposal. As she prepared a cup of tea to calm her nerves, she couldn't help but feel that she was getting into something much bigger than she could handle. She sat on her small sofa, holding the hot cup between her hands, and closed her eyes. Suddenly, a fleeting image crossed her mind. A smiling young man, with warm eyes and dark hair, reaching out to her in a sunny garden. The image disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving Sarah confused and with a feeling of nostalgia she couldn't explain. What was that? She murmured to herself, rubbing her temples Sarah had lived the last 10 years of her life with. A large part of her past blank a car accident when she was 18 had taken not only her parents, but also most of her childhood and teenage memories. The doctors had told her that the amnesia could be temporary, but as the years passed, Sarah had learned to live with these gaps in her memory. Now, however, something seemed to be changing. Since Jackson had told her about his brother's wedding, these fleeting images, these flashes of a forgotten past, began to appear more frequently. Sarah got up and went to her bedroom, where she opened the drawer of her nightstand. Inside was a small wooden box, the only object she had kept from her life before the accident. She opened it carefully, revealing its contents: a silver bracelet with a small heart-shaped charm. She took the bracelet between her fingers, gently caressing the charm. She didn't remember who had given it to her or what it meant, but whenever she held it, she felt a mixture of happiness and sadness that she couldn't explain. As she contemplated the jewel, another flash of memory assaulted her. This time, she saw a young boy putting the bracelet on her wrist, his eyes bright with excitement. "So you never forget me, Emily," the boy said in her vision. Sarah gasped, dropping the bracelet onto the bed. Emily? Why had the boy called her Emily? Her name had always been Sarah, hadn't it? With trembling hands, Sarah took her laptop and began to search for information about the Carter family. She needed to see a photo of Henry, Jackson's brother. When she finally found a recent image of him in a business article, her heart skipped a beat. It was him, the boy from her visions, now turned into a successful and handsome man. Henry Carter, the multimillionaire who was about to get married, was the same young man who smiled at her in her fragmented memories. "It can't be," whispered Sarah, feeling the world spin around her. "Who am I really, and what connection do I have with the Carter brothers?" At that moment, her phone rang, startling her. It was a message from Jackson. "Tomorrow we'll go shopping for your dress for the wedding. I want you to be the most beautiful woman at the party, after the bride. Of course, don't disappoint me. Sarah." The message only increased Sarah's anxiety. Now she was sure that Jackson was using her for something, but she couldn't imagine what. Did he know something about her past, about her connection with Henry? Meanwhile, in his luxurious penthouse, Jackson smiled with satisfaction. His plan was in motion, and soon he would see his younger brother fall from his pedestal. What he didn't know was that fate had some surprises in store that not even he, with all his cunning, could foresee. As the night progressed, both Sarah and Jackson prepared, each in their own way, for the events to come. She struggling with fragmented memories and unanswered questions, he sharpening the weapons of his revenge. And in the middle of it all, Henry Carter, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him, prepared for what he believed would be the happiest day of his life. The countdown to the wedding had begun, and with it, the unraveling of a web of secrets, lies, and repressed passions that threatened to destroy everyone involved. The New York sun shone brightly when Jackson picked up Sarah in his luxurious sports car. She got into the vehicle with some reluctance, still disturbed by the memories that had surfaced the night before. "Good morning, Sarah," Jackson greeted with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I hope you're ready for a day of shopping. I want you to look absolutely stunning at my dear brother's wedding." Sarah nodded silently, observing her boss's profile as he drove. How could she ask him about Henry without raising suspicions? She decided to test the waters cautiously. "Mr. Carter," she began, "I realized that I don't know much about your brother. What is he like?" Jackson gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white for an instant, before relaxing. "Oh, Henry," he responded with a forced laugh. "The prodigal son, the family favorite. He's always had everything served on a silver platter." The bitter tone in Jackson's voice didn't go unnoticed by Sarah clearly. There was a complicated history between the Carter brothers. They arrived at an exclusive boutique in the heart of the city. Jackson guided Sarah inside, where they were greeted by an overly enthusiastic saleswoman. "Mr. Carter, what an honor to have you here," the woman exclaimed. "How can we serve you today?" "We need the perfect dress for my companion," Jackson replied, placing a possessive hand on Sarah's lower back. "It's for my brother's wedding. I want all eyes to be on her." Sarah tensed at the contact but maintained a polite smile. The saleswoman guided them through a selection of designer dresses, each more elegant and expensive than the last days. Sarah tried on several dresses. Jackson observed her with a calculating look. Finally, he selected a scarlet-red dress with a plunging neckline and a slit that reached the thigh. "This is perfect," Jackson declared. "It will stand out among all the guests." Sarah looked at herself in the mirror, feeling uncomfortable with how revealing the dress was. However, as she saw herself reflected, another memory hit her hard. Flashback. She saw herself, younger in a similar dress in color and style. She was at a party, laughing and dancing with the young Henry. He looked at her with adoration, whispering in her ear, "You're the most beautiful woman in the world, Emily. I love you." End of flashback. Sarah staggered, leaning on the mirror to keep her balance. Jackson approached quickly, holding her by the shoulders. "Are you all right?" he asked, a note of genuine concern in his voice. "Yes, just a little dizzy," Sarah responded, trying to compose herself. "It must be the heat." Jackson looked at her suspiciously but didn't press. Further, "Well, we'll take this dress, and of course we'll need matching shoes and accessories." While Jackson took care of the purchase details, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the memory she had just experienced. Emily. Why did that name keep appearing in her visions? And more importantly, what relationship had she really had with Henry Carter? Back in the car, Sarah gathered the courage to ask a question that was eating her up inside. "Mr. Carter," she began cautiously, "did your brother Henry have any serious girlfriend in the past? Someone who perhaps suddenly disappeared?" Jackson braked abruptly, causing the cars behind to honk furiously. He turned his head to look at Sarah, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why do you ask that?" he inquired, his voice tense like a string about to break. Sarah shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Just curiosity. Since I'm going to pretend to be your girlfriend at the wedding, I thought I should know more about the family." Jackson observed her for a moment longer before turning, his attention back to the road. "There was someone," he finally said, his voice strangely flat. "A girl named Emily. She disappeared years ago, just before Henry left to study abroad. It was quite a scandal at the time." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Emily. The same name she had heard in her visions. "What happened to her?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Nobody knows for sure," Jackson replied, his indifferent tone contrasting with the tension in his hands on the steering wheel. "One day she was there, the next she had vanished. Henry was devastated, of course. He was always a sentimental one." Sarah nodded slowly, her mind working at full speed. Could she be that Emily? Was it possible that her accident and memory loss were related to her disappearance? The rest of the trip passed in tense silence. When they arrived at Sarah's building, Jackson stopped her before she could get out of the car. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft but with a dangerous edge, "I hope you understand the importance of your role at the wedding. I won't tolerate any unpleasant surprises." She nodded, feeling a shiver run down her spine. "Of course, Mr. Carter, I won't disappoint you." As she watched Jackson's car drive away, Sarah knew she was walking on a thin line. The secrets she was uncovering could be dangerous, but they could also be the key to recovering her lost past. The following days passed in a whirlwind of preparations for Sarah, between her usual responsibilities at the office and Jackson's rehearsals for her role at the wedding. She barely had time to process the fragments of memory that continued to surface one afternoon while organizing some documents in Jackson's office. The door burst open. Sarah looked up, surprised, and found herself face to face with Henry Carter. Time seemed to stand still. Henry, tall and handsome, with the same dark hair and warm eyes from her. Memories looked at her curiously. For a moment, Sarah thought she saw a flash of recognition in his eyes, but it disappeared so quickly that she thought she had imagined it. "Excuse me," Henry said with a kind smile. "I was looking for my brother. Is Jackson around?" Sarah took a moment to find her voice. "Mr. Carter is in a meeting." She finally managed to say, "I'm Sarah, his assistant. Can I help you with anything?" Henry extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Sarah. I'm Henry, Jackson's younger brother. Although I suppose you already knew that." When their hands touched, Sarah felt an electric shock run through her body. Fragmented images flooded her mind, shared laughter, stolen kisses, promises whispered under the stars. Do we know each other?" Henry asked, frowning slightly. "There's something about you that seems familiar." Before Sarah could respond, the door opened again and Jackson entered, his face transforming from surprise to a mask of cordiality upon seeing his brother. "Henry." "What a surprise," Jackson said, strategically placing himself between Sarah and his brother. "What brings you here?" Henry seemed to come out of a trance, taking his gaze away from Sarah. "Ah, Jackson. I wanted to talk to you about some wedding details. Vanessa insists that you should bring someone. She says she doesn't want you to be alone on such a special day." Jackson smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "How considerate of your future wife. In fact, I already have a date for the wedding. Sarah will be accompanying me." Henry's eyes widened in surprise, turning to Sarah. "Oh, I didn't know. You two were congratulations, I guess." Sarah felt she should say something, clarify the misunderstanding, but Jackson's warning look kept her silent. "Thank you, brother," Jackson replied, putting an arm around Sarah's shoulders in a possessive gesture. "We're very happy." The tension in the room was palpable. Henry looked alternately at Jackson and Sarah, as if trying to solve a complicated puzzle. "Well, I'm glad for you," Henry finally said, although his tone suggested otherwise. "I'll see you at the wedding then. It was a pleasure to meet you, Sarah." With one last confused look at her, Henry left the office. As soon as the door closed, Jackson released Sarah and turned to her, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "What was that?" he hissed. "Why was he looking at you like that? What did you tell him?" Sarah took a step back, alarmed by her boss's intensity. "Nothing, Mr. Carter. He arrived looking for you. I just introduced myself." Jackson studied her for a moment as if trying to determine if she was telling the truth. Finally, he seemed to relax a bit. "Good," he said. "Remember, Sarah, your loyalty is to me, not to Henry, not to anyone else, understood?" Sarah nodded, feeling a knot in her stomach. "Yes, Mr. Carter." As Jackson retreated to his private office, Sarah collapsed into her chair, her mind a whirlwind of emotions and unanswered questions. The encounter with Henry had awakened something in her, feelings and memories she couldn't ignore. But now, caught between the two Carter brothers, Sarah realized she was playing a dangerous game. A game where the secrets of the past threatened to destroy not only her present, but also her future. Meanwhile, in his luxurious apartment, Henry couldn't get the image of Sarah out of his head. There was something about her in her eyes that seemed painfully familiar. He took an old photograph from a drawer, an image of him and Emily in happier times. "Who are you really, Sarah?" he murmured, comparing the photo with the face he had just seen. "And why do I feel like I've known you forever?" As the wedding date approached, the tension in Jackson Carter's office became increasingly palpable. Sarah found herself constantly watched, not only by her boss but also by the curious eyes of her co-workers, who whispered about her sudden relationship with the powerful lawyer. One afternoon, while Sarah was organizing some files in the office storage room, she felt a presence behind her. As she turned, she came face to face with Vanessa Mitchell, Henry's fiancée. "So you're the famous Sarah," Vanessa said, her voice soft but with a tone that suggested danger. "Jackson Carter's new girlfriend." Sarah swallowed hard, suddenly feeling cornered. "Miss Mitchell, Save it," Vanessa interrupted, taking a step closer. "I don't know what game you and Jackson are playing, but I'm warning you. I won't let anything ruin my wedding." The determination in Vanessa's eyes made Sarah shudder. "I don't know what you're talking about," she managed to say. "Mr. Carter and I are just a couple," Vanessa completed with a dry laugh. "Please, I've known the Carter brothers for years. Jackson has never been the type to fall in love. And there's something about you that doesn't add up." Sarah felt her heart racing. Did Vanessa suspect something about her true identity? "Listen carefully," Vanessa continued, her voice barely a whisper. "I've worked too hard to get here. My wedding to Henry will be perfect, and neither you nor Jackson will ruin it. Understood?" Before Sarah could respond, Vanessa had already turned around and left the storage room, leaving behind the echo of her heels and an atmosphere charged with threat. That night in her apartment, Sarah couldn't sleep. Vanessa's words echoed in her mind, mixing with the fragments of memories that continued to torment her. She decided she needed answers, and she knew exactly where to look for them. The next morning, feigning illness, Sarah headed to the hospital where she had been treated after her accident years ago. With a mixture of determination and fear, she approached the medical records counter. "Good afternoon," she said, trying to keep calm. "I need to access my medical records from 10 years ago. I was here after a car accident." The nurse looked at her sympathetically. "Of course. What's your name?" Sarah Rivers," she responded, realizing that she wasn't even sure if that was her real name. After several minutes of searching, the nurse frowned. "I'm sorry, I can't find any records under that name for that date. Are you sure it was at this hospital?" Sarah's heart sank. "Yes, I'm sure. Maybe could you search under the name Emily?" The nurse looked at her curiously but nodded. After a few moments, her eyes widened in surprise. "There's something here, Emily Castle, admitted 10 years ago for a car accident." But what?" Sarah pressed, feeling she was on the brink of a crucial discovery. "According to these records, Emily Castle died from her injuries 3 days after the accident." Sarah felt the world fading around her. How could she be dead if she was there, standing, breathing? Who was she really? And why had someone faked her death? She left the hospital with more questions than answers, her mind a whirlwind of theories and fears. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice the black car following her at a distance, nor the familiar figure. Behind the wheel, Jackson Carter, with an expression of cold determination on his face. Meanwhile, at the Carter mansion, Henry was in his late father's study, looking through old family albums. He stopped at a photo of him and Emily, taken shortly before her disappearance. He compared the image with the recent memory of Sarah and felt a chill run down his spine. "It can't be," he murmured to himself. "It's impossible." But the more he looked at the photo, the more convinced he became Sarah and Emily were the same person. But how was that possible? And what role did Jackson play in all this? Henry took his phone, determined to get to the bottom of the matter. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Hello?" a deep voice answered on the other end of the line. "I need your help," Henry said. "It's about Emily. I think I've found her." The wedding day was approaching, rapidly, and with it, the tension between all those involved reached unbearable levels. Sarah, overwhelmed by her recent discoveries, struggled to maintain her composure as she continued with the preparations alongside Jackson one afternoon. While reviewing the final details in Jackson's office, Sarah could no longer contain her questions. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to know the truth. What do you really know about me?" Jackson looked at her intently, his face an impenetrable mask. For a moment it seemed he was going to ignore the question, but then he let out a tired sigh. "I always knew this day would come," he said, getting up to pour himself a drink. "I suppose it's time you know the truth, Sarah, or should I say Emily?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Then it's true I am Emily." Jackson nodded slowly. "Yes, you are Emily Castle, my dear." Of her past began to fit together. "The accident," she murmured. "It wasn't an accident," Jackson confirmed, turning to her. It was organized by our father. The intention was to scare you, to drive you away from Henry. But things got out of control. Your parents died and you lost your memory. Tears were now freely running down Sarah's cheeks. And then what? Why didn't you tell me the truth when I woke up? Jackson let out a humorless laugh. That was my contribution to the plan. You see, I had always been jealous of Henry. He had everything, our parents' love, success, and you. When I saw the opportunity to take something from him, I took it. Sarah looked at him in horror. You used me all this time. At first, yes, Jackson admitted. I gave you a new identity, got you this job. I thought I could mold you, turn you into someone who would love me, instead of Henry. But over time I realized it would never work. Your feelings for him were too deeply rooted, even without your memories. And now? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why are you telling me all this now? Jackson approached her, his face a mixture of regret and determination. Because I can't continue with this charade anymore, seeing how Henry looks at you, how you look at him, I realized I can't stand between you as much as I want to. At that moment, the office door burst open. Henry entered, his face a mask of fury and pain. How could you, Jackson? He roared. How could you do this to us? Sarah turned, surprised. Henry, how? I heard everything, Henry said, not taking his eyes off his brother. I came to confront you, Jackson, to demand the truth about Sarah. I never imagined, I never thought you would go this far. Jackson met his brother's gaze. I'm sorry, Henry. I know it's not enough, but I truly am sorry. Henry took a step towards Sarah, his eyes filled with unshed tears. Emily, is it really true? Is it you? Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Henry wrapped her in his arms, and at that moment, an avalanche of memories flooded Sarah's mind. Her childhood, her first kiss with Henry, the promises of eternal love. Everything came back in a rush. I've missed you so much, Henry whispered against her hair. All these years I never stopped looking for you. Jackson watched the scene with a mixture of emotions. He knew he had lost, that his plan for revenge had backfired, but a part of him felt relieved, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. You should go, he finally said. You have a lot to talk about. Henry separated from Sarah enough to look at his brother. This isn't over, Jackson. You'll have to answer for what you've done. Jackson nodded. I know and I will, but now go make up for lost time. As Henry and Sarah left the office, hand in hand, Jackson collapsed into his chair. He knew the consequences of his actions were coming, but for the first time in years he felt he had done the right thing. However, as the couple left the building, none of them noticed the figure watching them from a car parked across the street. Vanessa Mitchell, her eyes filled with fury and determination, took out her phone and dialed a number. Change of plans, she said, as soon as they answered. I need you to take care of something, and this time, make sure the job is done right. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions for Sarah, or Emily, as she now knew was her real name. Each hour brought new memories, pieces of the puzzle of her past. Life that finally fit into place. Henry had cancelled all his commitments to be with her, helping her navigate the sea of memories and emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. They were sitting on the balcony of Henry's apartment, watching the sunset over New York City, when Emily finally asked the question that had been on her mind. What will happen with Vanessa? She asked quietly. Your wedding. Henry took her hand, his eyes full of determination. The wedding is off. I spoke with Vanessa this morning. It wasn't an easy conversation. Emily felt a pang of guilt. I'm sorry. Henry, I didn't want to cause so much pain. It's not your fault, he replied, gently caressing her cheek. None of this is your fault, Vanessa. She'll understand in time, I hope. What Henry didn't tell Emily was that Vanessa hadn't taken the news well at all. Her screams still echoed in his ears, her threats to destroy him, and that imposter had been chilling in their intensity. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Jackson Carter was facing the consequences of his actions. He was sitting in the police interrogation room, answering questions about his involvement in the cover-up of Emily's accident and the forgery of documents. "Mr. Carter," said the detective, his voice loaded with contempt, "do you understand the gravity of the charges against you?" Jackson nodded, his face a mask of resignation. "I understand, Detective, and I'm willing to cooperate fully." At that moment, the door opened and a man in a suit entered, carrying a briefcase. "Detective, I'm Mr. Carter's lawyer. I'd like to speak with my client in private." Once alone, the lawyer sat across from Jackson. "Things don't look good, Mr. Carter, but I have a proposal that could help us both." Jackson raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I'm listening." The lawyer smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "There are certain interested parties who would be willing to make this situation disappear, in exchange, of course, for certain favors." "What kind of favors?" Jackson asked, his survival instinct fighting against his newly discovered conscience. "Nothing too complicated," the lawyer replied with a deceptively friendly smile. "We just need you to help us handle a situation with your brother and Miss Castle." Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. He knew he was at a crossroads. He could accept the offer and save himself, but at the cost of betraying his brother and Emily again, or he could reject it and face the consequences of his actions. As Jackson struggled with his decision, Emily and Henry were enjoying a moment of peace. Unaware of the storm that was brewing, they were making plans for the future, talking about making up for lost time when Henry's phone rang. "Hello?" Henry answered. His face paled as he listened. "I understand we'll be there." "What's wrong?" Emily asked, worried by the change in his expression. Henry looked at her, his eyes full of concern. "It was my contact in the police. Jackson is being interrogated, and there are rumors that Vanessa is planning something. They don't know what, but they warned us to be careful." Emily felt fear taking over her, just when she thought things were finally getting sorted out. The past threatened to catch up with them again. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Henry hugged her tightly. "We'll face this together. I'm not going to lose you again, Emily, no matter what happens." As the sun set over New York City, the couple prepared to face whatever. Manipulation of Emily, the lies. It all seemed so insignificant now. "No," he finally said, opening his eyes with new determination. "I'm not going to continue with this. I've made enough mistakes. It's time to face the consequences." The lawyer looked at him with a mixture of surprise and contempt. "You're making a serious mistake, Mr. Carter. My clients won't take this decision well." "Maybe," Jackson replied, "but for the first time in a long time, I'm doing the right thing." Meanwhile, in Henry's apartment, Emily and he were preparing to leave. They had decided to go to the police station to talk to Jackson and get more information about Vanessa's alleged threats. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Henry asked, taking Emily's hands in his. She nodded, her eyes full of determination. "Yes, Jackson may have made mistakes, but he also saved my life in his own way. And if Vanessa is planning something, we need to know." Just as they were about to leave, Henry's phone rang again. It was his contact in the police. "What? Are you sure?" Henry exclaimed, his face paling. "I understand. Thanks for letting me know." "What's happening?" Emily asked, feeling her heart racing. Henry looked at her, his eyes full of concern. "Jackson has turned himself in. He's confessed everything. The accident, the cover-up, everything. And there's more. Vanessa has disappeared. No one knows where she is." Emily felt the world swaying under her feet. My God, what have we unleashed? At that moment, the doorbell of the apartment rang. Henry and Emily looked at each other, fear reflected in each other's eyes. Cautiously, Henry approached the door and looked through the peephole. It's my father," he said. Surprised, Emily gasped. "Your father? But I thought he had died." Henry shook his head. "That's what Jackson made us believe, but apparently he's been alive all this time." With trembling hands, Henry opened the door. There, standing in the hallway, was Edward Carter. "The man who had orchestrated this entire tragedy from the beginning, son," Edward said, his voice tired but firm. "I think it's time we had a long conversation." As Edward Carter entered the apartment, in another part of the city, Vanessa Mitchell was meeting with a group of grim-looking men. "Is everything ready?" she asked, her voice cold as ice. The leader of the group nodded. "Yes, Miss Mitchell. We can proceed when you order." Vanessa smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good. It's time for the Carters to learn that no one messes with a Mitchell." The silence in Henry's apartment was so thick it could almost be cut with a knife. Edward Carter, the patriarch everyone believed dead, was sitting across from his son and Emily, his imposing presence filling the room. "I know you have many questions," Edward began, his voice tired but firm, "and I've come to give you answers." Henry, who had been containing his anger, finally exploded. "Answers? After all this time? After all the pain you've caused?" Edward didn't flinch at his son's outburst. "I understand your anger, Henry I. Deserve it, but before you judge me, you need to know the whole truth." Emily, who had remained silent until now, spoke. "And what is that truth, Mr. Carter? What could justify what you did to all of us?" The old man sighed deeply before beginning his tale. "It all started years ago, long before you two met. The Carter family was on the brink of ruin. Our businesses were failing, and we had debts with very dangerous people." Henry and Emily listened intently as Edward continued. "I made a deal with the Mitchell family. They would save our businesses in exchange for an alliance through marriage. You, Henry, were to marry Vanessa." "But then you appeared, Emily," Edward said, looking directly at her, "and I saw how my carefully planned future was crumbling. The Mitchells threatened to withdraw from the agreement if the engagement wasn't fulfilled. I was desperate and made terrible decisions." "The accident," Emily whispered, feeling her heart shrink. Edward nodded, guilt evident in his eyes. "I never intended for you to get hurt, much less for your parents to. I'm so sorry, Emily. I've lived with that guilt all these years." Henry, who had been listening with a mixture of horror and disbelief, finally spoke. "And faking your death, letting Jackson bear all the blame." "Another cowardly decision," Edward admitted. "I thought if I disappeared, I could protect you from the consequences of my actions, but I only made things worse." While this revelation was unfolding in Henry's apartment at the police station, Jackson Carter was facing his own moment of truth. "Mr. Carter," said the detective, "your confession is surprising. Do you understand that this could send you to prison for many years?" Jackson nodded, a strange peace reflected on his face. "I understand, detective, and I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions." At that moment, the interrogation room door burst open. An officer entered, his face pale. "Detective, you need to see this." He turned on the TV in the corner of the room. A breaking news bulletin filled the screen. The reporter, with a tense voice, related the events. "Moments ago, an explosion occurred in the Carter Enterprises building. Witnesses report having seen a group of armed individuals enter the building shortly before the explosion. It's not yet known if there are any casualties." Jackson jumped to his feet, his face a mask of horror. "No, no, no, Henry, Emily." Back in Henry's apartment, the sound of the explosion resonated in the distance. Interrupting the tense conversation, Henry ran to the window, just in time to see a column of smoke rising over the city skyline. "My God," he gasped. "It's the company building." Edward stood up, his face pale. "Vanessa," he muttered. "It must be her doing." At that precise moment, Henry's phone rang. It was an unknown number. With trembling hands, he answered and put it on speakerphone. "Henry, darling." Vanessa's cold voice filled the room. "I hope you enjoyed the show. Consider this my wedding gift." "Vanessa, what have you done?" Henry asked, horrified. Vanessa's laughter echoed through the phone. "Oh, this is just the beginning. You and your precious Emily took everything from me. Now I'll take everything from you, and when I'm done, you'll wish you'd never met." The call cut off, leaving the three in an eerie silence. Emily was the first to react. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "It's not safe." Henry nodded, taking her hand. "You're right, Father. Are you coming with us?" Edward looked at them, years of guilt and regret reflected in his eyes. "I'll go with you. It's time I face my mistakes and do the right thing for once." As the three hurried to leave the apartment at the police station, Jackson was struggling against the officers trying to stop him. "I have to go there," he shouted. "My brother is in danger." The detective held him firmly. "Mr. Carter, calm down. You can't leave here. You're in custody?" Jackson collapsed into the chair, despair taking over him. "Please," he begged. "I've made many mistakes, but I can't let my brother pay for them. You have to help him." The detective looked at him for a long moment before making a decision. "All right, we'll go together, but if you try anything, I won't hesitate to handcuff you, understood?" Jackson nodded, grateful. As they left the station, he couldn't help but think about all the decisions that had led him to this moment. He hoped it wasn't too late to make things right. The New York night was illuminated by the glow of the fire in the Carter building, while police and ambulance sirens filled the air. The entire city seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this family drama that now threatened to consume everything in its path would unfold. The night in New York had turned into chaos of sirens, emergency, lights, and the persistent smell of smoke. Henry, Emily, and Edward moved quickly through the city streets, trying to stay in the shadows and avoid being seen. "Where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper as they hurried down a dark alley. Henry looked around cautiously before answering, "I have a safe place. An apartment I bought years ago under a false name. No one knows about it, not even Jackson." Edward, who had remained silent until now, spoke. "Son, we need a plan. Vanessa won't stop with this." "I know," Henry replied, his voice tense, "but first, we need to get to a safe place and regroup." Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Jackson and the detective were approaching the burning Carter building. The chaos at the scene was indescribable. Firefighters fighting the fire, police cordoning off the area, and a crowd of onlookers and journalists trying to get closer. "I don't see Henry anywhere," Jackson said, his voice full of concern. The detective scanned the crowd. Maybe he wasn't in the building when the explosion occurred. At that moment, Jackson's phone rang. It was an unknown number. With his heart pounding, he answered, "Jackson Carter," a cold female voice said on the other end of the line. "What a pleasant surprise. I thought you'd be behind bars by now." "Vanessa," Jackson growled, "what have you done?" Vanessa's laughter sounded hollow through the phone. "Oh, Jackson, always so dramatic. This is just the beginning. Your brother and that tramp took everything from me. Now, I'll take everything from you." "Vanessa, stop this madness," Jackson pleaded. "We can fix this, fix it." Vanessa's voice filled with venom. "No, Jackson. This goes beyond fixing. This is revenge. And when I'm done, the Carter family will be nothing but an unpleasant memory in New York's history." The call cut off, leaving Jackson with a feeling of terror in his stomach. He turned to the detective who had been listening. "We have to find Henry and Emily," Jackson said. "They're in danger." The detective nodded. "I'm going to put out an alert, but Mr. Carter, remember that you're still in custody." Jackson barely heard him. His mind was busy trying to figure out where his brother and Emily could have gone. Meanwhile, in Henry's secret apartment, the three fugitives finally had a moment to breathe. "What are we going to do now?" Emily asked, sitting on the edge of a worn sofa. Henry began to pace back and forth across the small living room. "We need evidence. Something that links Vanessa to the attack on the building." Edward, who had been looking out the window, turned to them. "I can help with that," he said, his voice loaded with determination. "I have information about the Mitchells' shady businesses, information I've been keeping as insurance all these years." Henry and Emily looked at him surprised. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Henry asked. "Because I hoped I'd never have to use it," Edward replied. "But now it's our best chance to stop Vanessa and expose the truth." At that moment, Henry's phone vibrated with a message. It was from an unknown number, but the content made his blood run cold. "I found you. You have 1 hour to turn yourselves in, or the next explosion will be in a much more personal place. Tick-tock, Henry." Henry showed the message to Emily and Edward, their faces paling as they read it. "How did she find us so quickly?" Emily whispered, fear evident in her voice. Edward closed his eyes, an expression of pain crossing his face. "Because I led her here," he finally said. Henry and Emily looked at him, stunned. "What?" Henry exclaimed, disbelief and betrayal clear in his voice. Edward raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I had no choice. They threatened your mother, Henry. They said they would kill her if I didn't help them find you." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Henry felt the world crumbling around him once again. Emily, for her part, looked between father and son, seeing how years of lies and secrets finally came to a breaking point. "What do we do now?" Emily asked. Finally breaking the silence, Henry took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "We can't keep running. It's time to face this head-on." "But Henry," Emily protested, "it's too dangerous." "I know," he replied, taking her hand. "But we have no other choice. If we turn ourselves in, at least we can control the situation to some extent." Edward approached them. "I'll go with you. It's time I take responsibility for my actions." As the three prepared for what could be their last move, in another part of the city, Jackson had finally managed to convince the detective to let him help in the search for Henry and Emily. "I know my brother," Jackson insisted. "I know how he thinks I can help you find him before Vanessa does." The detective looked at him skeptically, but finally nodded. "All right, Carter, but if you try anything—" I know," Jackson interrupted. "Straight to jail, understood." As dawn began to break on the New York horizon, the different actors in this drama prepared for the final act. Henry, Emily, and Edward were heading towards an uncertain destination. Willing to face Vanessa and her threats, Jackson and the police were racing against time to find them. First, and somewhere in the city, Vanessa Mitchell waited, like a spider in the center of her web, ready to catch her prey. The countdown had begun, and the next few hours would determine the fate of everyone involved. The truth, so long buried, was about to come to light, with consequences that no one could foresee. The sun was beginning to peek over the New York horizon, tinting the sky with golden and reddish hues. The city was slowly waking up, oblivious to the drama that was about to unfold in its streets. Henry, Emily, and Edward were heading towards the agreed meeting place with Vanessa, the old, abandoned pier at the port. The silence in the car was tense, each one immersed in their own thoughts and fears. "We can still turn back," Emily said, breaking the silence. "We could go far away, start over." Henry took her hand, squeezing it gently. "No, Emily, it's time to end this once and for all. No more running, no more secrets." Edward, sitting in the back seat, nodded sadly. "My son is right. I've spent too many years running from my mistakes. It's time to face them." Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Jackson and the detective were racing against the clock. Thanks to Jackson's contacts, they had managed to track Henry's phone. "They're heading towards the port," Jackson said, looking at the map on his phone. "I know Vanessa. She'll choose an isolated place, probably the old abandoned pier." The detective nodded, stepping on the accelerator. "We're going to need backup," he said, taking his radio to give the alert. At the pier, Vanessa waited, surrounded by her armed men. Her face was a mask of cold determination, her eyes shining with a mixture of pain and vengeance. "Miss Mitchell," one of her men said, "a car is approaching." Vanessa smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Perfect. Let the show begin." Henry's car stopped a few meters from where Vanessa was. The three occupants got out slowly with their hands up. Well, Vanessa said, her voice loaded with sarcasm. "The happy family finally reunited. How touching." "Vanessa," Henry began, taking a step forward. "This has gone too far. We can settle this in a civilized manner." Vanessa let out a bitter laugh. "Civilized? After what you did to me? After humiliating me in front of all of New York's high society? No, Henry. This ends here and now." Emily, who had remained silent until that moment, spoke. "Vanessa, I understand your pain. I also suffered because of lies and manipulations, but violence is not the answer." "You don't understand anything," Vanessa spat, her face contorted with anger. "You took everything from me. My future, my position, my dignity. And now I'll take everything from you." At that moment, the sound of sirens began to be heard in the distance. Vanessa looked around, alarmed. "What have you done?" she shouted, pulling out a gun and pointing it at Henry. "No!" Emily screamed, jumping in front of Henry. Everything seemed to move in slow motion, Vanessa's finger on the trigger. Emily jumping in front of Henry, Edward running towards them. The shot rang out in the air, followed by a heart-wrenching scream. Edward fell to the ground, blood staining his shirt. He had intercepted the bullet meant for his son, father. Henry shouted, running towards Edward. At that moment, several police cars burst onto the scene, with Jackson jumping out of the first one before it had even come to a complete stop. "Vanessa, stop!" Jackson shouted. "It's over!" Vanessa, surrounded by the police and seeing her plan crumble, dropped the gun and fell to her knees, tears of frustration running down her cheeks. As the police took Vanessa and her men away, Henry and Emily knelt beside Edward. "Father, hold on," Henry pleaded, pressing the wound. Edward coughed, blood staining his lips. "Henry, Emily, I'm so sorry for everything." "Shh, don't talk," Emily said, taking his hand. "Help is on the way." Jackson approached, his face a mask of shock and regret. I'm so sorry. All of this is my fault." Edward weakly shook his head. "No, son, we all made mistakes, but now you have the chance to make things right." The ambulance sirens were approaching, but everyone knew it was a race against time. Edward looked at his children, a small smile on his lips. "I love you both," he whispered. "Take care of each other." With those words, Edward Carter closed his eyes for the last time, leaving his children and Emily in a heartbroken embrace. As the sun rose completely over New York, illuminating the scene at the pier, an era was coming to an end. The secrets had been revealed, the lies exposed, and the price paid. Now, facing Henry, Emily, and Jackson, an uncertain future stretched out, but one full of possibilities for redemption and reconciliation. The tragedy of the Carters had reached its climax, but their story was far from over. Amidst the pain and loss, there existed the opportunity for a new beginning, a chance to rebuild what had been broken and to heal the wounds of the past. 3 months had passed since that fateful morning at the pier. New York had slowly recovered from the scandal that had shaken one of its most prominent families. Life, as always, went on. In Greenwood Cemetery, Henry, Emily, and Jackson stood in front of Edward Carter's grave. The day was clear and sunny, a contrast to the somber reason for their visit. "I still find it hard to believe he's gone," Henry said, his voice loaded with emotion. Emily took his hand, squeezing it gently. "He died protecting his son. In the end, he showed how much he loved you both." Jackson, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "I know I have no right to be here, after everything I did." Henry interrupted him, putting a hand on his shoulder. "You're my brother, Jackson. Despite everything, Father would want you to be here." The three remained silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts and memories. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "What will happen now with the company?" Henry sighed. "We'll rebuild it from scratch if necessary, but this time we'll do it right. No secrets, no manipulations." Jackson nodded. "I want to help. I know I can't erase my mistakes, but I want to try to make amends." "It won't be easy," Henry warned. "Public trust in the Carter name is at rock bottom." "Then we'll change the name," Emily suggested. "A new beginning, a new identity." The brothers looked at her, considering the idea. "It could work," Jackson said slowly. "Carter Castle Enterprises," Henry proposed, looking at Emily with love. "A tribute to our families and a symbol of unity." Emily smiled, tears of emotion in her eyes. "I like how that sounds." As they left the cemetery, the future seemed to stretch out before them, full of challenges, but also hope. "And what about us?" Emily asked Henry when they were alone. "Do you think we can overcome all of this?" Henry looked at her, his eyes full of determination and love. "Emily, we've been through hell and survived. Our love has withstood lies, separation, and betrayal. I believe it can withstand anything." Emily smiled, leaning on his shoulder. You're right. Besides, I think it's time we make us official. Henry looked at her, surprised. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? Well, Emily said with a mischievous smile, since the last wedding didn't take place, it would be a shame to waste all those preparations, don't you think? Henry laughed, the sound light and full of joy, something that hadn't been heard in a long time. Emily Castle, are you proposing to me? Maybe, she replied, her eyes shining with love and amusement. What do you say? In response, Henry kissed her, a kiss full of promises and hopes for the future. Meanwhile, in a maximum security prison on the outskirts of the city, Vanessa Mitchell looked out the small window of her cell. Her face, once beautiful and full of life, was now marked by lines of bitterness and regret. A guard approached her cell. Mitchell, you have a visitor. Vanessa turned, surprised she wasn't expecting visitors. When she saw who it was, her eyes widened in shock. Jackson Carter was standing on the other side of the bars. What are you doing here? Vanessa asked, her voice hoarse from lack of use. Jackson looked at her, his face a mixture of complex emotions. I came to tell you that I forgive you, Vanessa, and to ask for your forgiveness too. Vanessa stared at him, tears forming in her eyes. For the first time in months, she felt the weight of guilt and hatred beginning to lighten as Jackson spoke with Vanessa, offering an olive branch and the possibility of redemption. In another part of the city, Henry and Emily were beginning to plan their future together. The saga of the Carter brothers had been one of betrayal, lies, and pain. But it had also been a story of love, forgiveness, and second chances. And now, as the sun set over New York, a new era was beginning. An era of honesty, reconciliation, and hope. Because in the end, even in the darkest stories, there is always room for light. And the Carter family, with all its imperfections and scars, had finally found its way to that light. As the days passed, Henry, Emily, and Jackson worked tirelessly to rebuild not only their family relationships, but also their business empire. Carter Castle Enterprises slowly began to emerge from the ashes of scandal, with a new ethos of transparency and ethical business practices. The road wasn't easy. Many former business partners were hesitant to work with them, and the media continued to scrutinize their every move. But with perseverance and a genuine commitment to change, they began to make progress. Emily, with her fresh perspective and innovative ideas, became a key player in the company's rebranding efforts. Her background in marketing proved invaluable as they worked to reshape public perception of the Carter name Jackson, determined to make amends, threw himself into philanthropic efforts. He established a foundation to help victims of corporate fraud and worked closely with law enforcement to expose other companies engaged in illegal practices. Slowly but surely, he began to earn back some of the respect he had lost. Henry, as the new CEO, steered the company with a steady hand. He made it his mission to create a corporate culture that valued integrity above all else. His leadership style, a stark contrast to his father's, earned him the loyalty of employees and the cautious approval of industry watchdogs. As for their personal lives, Henry and Emily's relationship continued to flourish. They decided to have a small, intimate wedding ceremony, a far cry from the lavish affair that had been planned with Vanessa. Surrounded by a handful of close friends and family, including a remorseful Jackson, they exchanged vows in a quiet garden ceremony. The months turned into years, and the Carter family's story of redemption became a topic of business school case studies and inspirational books. They had managed to turn their tragedy into a triumph, not just in business, but in life. One crisp autumn morning, 5 years after that fateful day at the pier, Henry and Emily stood in front of Edward Carter's grave once again. This time, they weren't alone. In Emily's arms was a small bundle, their newborn daughter, Sophia. I wish he could have met her, Emily said softly, looking down at their sleeping child. Henry put his arm around her, his eyes misting over. He would have adored her, just like I do. As they stood there, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby trees. For a moment it felt as if Edward's spirit was with them, offering a silent blessing. Jackson joined them a few minutes later, his face softer than it had been in years. The weight of guilt and rivalry that had once burdened him had largely lifted, replaced by a genuine desire to be a good brother and uncle. "She's beautiful," he said, smiling at his niece. "You two have done well." The three of them stood there, a picture of family unity that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. They had weathered the storm, faced their demons, and come out stronger on the other side. As they left the cemetery, Emily turned to Henry. "You know, I've been thinking maybe it's time we tell our story, the whole story, not just for us, but for Sophia, so she knows where she comes from, and the strength it took to get here." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "I think you're right. It's time to let go of the last of our secrets. No more hiding, no more shame, just the truth and the hope that others might learn from our mistakes and our journey." Jackson, overhearing this, added, "I'd like to be part of that too if you'll let me. I have a lot to answer for, but also a lot to share about redemption and second chances." As they walked back to their car, the future stretched out before them, bright with possibility. They had transformed their legacy from one of deceit and tragedy to one of honesty, resilience, and love. The Carter family's story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But now, they faced the future together, stronger for having weathered the storms of the past, and ready to write a new chapter filled with hope, integrity, and the unbreakable bonds of family. As Sophia grew older, she would come to know the full story of her family's past, not as a dark secret to be ashamed of, but as a testament to the power of truth, forgiveness, and the enduring strength of love. And in that knowledge, she would find the inspiration to forge her own path, carrying forward the best of the Carter Castle legacy into a bright and promising future. Brother Henry's first and only love. But how? Why fake my death? Why keep me in the dark all these years? Sarah asked, her voice trembling with a mix of emotions. Jackson took a long sip of his drink before answering. "It wasn't my decision. At least not at first. It was our father who orchestrated everything." Sarah looked at him in astonishment. "Your father? Why would he do something like that?" "Power, money, control," Jackson enumerated bitterly, "the usual reasons for Edward Carter. You see, Emily, you were a threat to his plans." Jackson approached the window, his gaze lost in the New York skyline. Our father always had great ambitions for the Carter family. He had planned an advantageous marriage for Henry, an alliance with another powerful family. But then you appeared, and suddenly all his plans were in danger. Sarah listened, stunned, as the fragments